Most mobile applications require that the user log in to access some kind of functionality. This video shows you how to build a React Native login form with Redux. Actually, that's a lie. This is a video series, and by the end of the series, you'll have this login form with Redux. But this first video is just kind of the very basics of getting going with Redux to build a login form. Now, by the time the video series is over, you'll have this login form where you can type in your username and password, and when you click this button, you will, let's refresh this. When you click this button, you'll see this activity indicator that kind of simulates a network request, and then you're brought right back here, assuming that the request completes successfully. Also notice that I can change the orientation of the application, and everything works fine. So that's kind of what the finished product looks like. Let's get started. I'm going to go ahead and refresh. And here's, before anything works. You can see this button doesn't do anything now. So let's go ahead and look at what we have here. So when we're working with Redux, one of the most helpful things we can do in the beginning is just think about the state that represents our application. And we're going to go ahead and define this state in the constructor. So for us, we have the username that the user is typing into the field, and we also have the password that the user is typing in. Now, in this case, since we have that little activity indicator spinning thing, we're actually going to need some UI state that tells us whether there's a currently pending login request. So let's go ahead and add a property to our state object called pending login request. And this is just kind of a first approximation of the state that we're going to need. The next thing that's helpful to do when we're working with Redux is to think about the actions that can actually change the state of our screen or our app. And there's several actions in our case. There's the action of the user typing in the username field, typing in the password field, and actually clicking this login button here. But we're only actually going to write down just one of these actions, just so that we can kind of get started with using Redux here. And the action that I want to be interested in is the type username action. So I'm going to go ahead and create that action. And then I'm going to go ahead and create the action creator for that action. And we'll call that type username. Word. And this action creator is going to take the text that the user is typing and return an action that represents the user typing. And this action is going to have a type property, which is simply the name of the action, and it's also going to have a text property, which is the text that the user's typing in. So we have kind of our state, and we have an action. The next thing that we need is our reducer. And the reducer is something that's actually passed into the create store function for Redux. So let's go ahead and grab Redux. And we're also going to need to grab the React bindings for Redux. So let's do that. Okay, now that we have both of those installed, we can go ahead and import the create store function from Redux. And so let's start with that. And we're going to go ahead and create our store in this component constructor, and we're going to pass in our reducer and our initial state. So actually this should come after we've defined the initial state. Okay, now the reducer takes the previous state and the action that's been dispatched. And so when the user types in to this field here, what we want to do is we want to basically return a new state that just incorporates the text that they've typed in here. So let's do that. And we're not going to worry about any of their actions right now. We're just going to return a new object that spreads over state and changes the username property to the text that the user is typing in. Now, in order to actually make sure that our reducer and our actions are working properly, we need to kind of wire this up to our React Native application. And the way that we do that is with the React Redux bindings. So we're going to need the connect function, and we're also going to need a component called a provider. And I'll explain what these are in just a moment. Okay, so this connect function actually returns a function that, when given a React Native component, will return a container component. Now, container components are actually intermediaries between kind of primitive React Native components and your Redux store. And they do two things. One, they take new state updates from the Redux store, and they map that state to the properties of a contained component. And in this case, the contained component that we're interested in is a text input, this element here. We want this to be contained in a container component so that it's smart about basically updates that are coming from the Redux store. And in order for this container component to act as an intermediary, we need to give it a function. Let's actually give a name for this container component. We'll call it login form text input. And the first parameter of this connect function is actually a function that maps from the state object that we define down here to the properties on the contained component that we want to update as a result of changes in the state. And so this function takes a state and it returns an object that's used to set the properties on the contained text input. So what we want this to return is this value property here on this object, and this value is going to be set to the username. So this value property here is actually going to be used to set the value prop on the text input that's contained inside of this login form text input container component. And the next thing that we need, and this is the second parameter of the connect function, is a function that maps from the event props on the contained component to a function that will dispatch our actions that we're interested in. And in this case, we're interested in the onChangeText event prop on the text input component. And what we want to do is we want to take the text that's being changed, and we want to use that text to dispatch the type username action using this action creator that we just created a few minutes ago. So now what we have is this container component that's wired up with our Redux store. And the way that we expose the store to this container component is by using the provider component that we imported from the React Redux bindings. And this provider component exposes the store to all of its children. And so we'll go ahead and give the store that we've created in the constructor as a prop to the provider. And then we can actually replace this text input with a login form text input. And let's see what happens. Okay, so now when I type in here, let's actually make sure that the state is being updated properly. And the easiest way to do that, right now anyway, is just to log it. So let's go ahead and let's log our action, and we'll stringify it so that we can actually get something useful here. And then we will say log. Okay, we're typing in here. We are not getting anything. Good. So we see that we're actually getting actions dispatched to our reducer, and that these actions contain the right data. So there you have it. You have kind of the very basics of getting started with Redux in your React Native application. Check back soon for the next part in this video series so that you can have an entire working login form in your app.